The sun had not yet broken through the thick English fog over Biggin Hill, and already the echo of metal tools against aircraft skins filled the air. The ground was slick with mud and oil, and every mechanic of the RAF seemed to carry the weight of the entire war on his back. The distant growl of Rolls-Royce Merlin engines being tested inside the hangars, mixed with the sharp scent of fuel and the silent tension that hung in the morning mist. If you love true stories of forgotten heroes and unlikely inventions, subscribe now and drop a like. Your support helps us uncover more real events that sound almost too incredible to be true. It was 1940, the height of the Battle of Britain. The Luftwaffe struck almost every day, and the British airfields fought not only to survive but to keep the Spitfires flying. Among those men, covered in grease and exhaustion, worked George Henshaw, a 29-year-old mechanic from Birmingham. He had no formal engineering degree, but he possessed something no manual could teach: instinct and creativity. In an age of scarcity, George was the kind of man who could turn scrap into salvation. He was responsible for maintaining one of the most battered squadrons on the base, and each day he watched his pilots return with their wings peppered with bullet holes, the gun covers torn, and the panels on the leading edge vibrating as if the aircraft itself were falling apart. The Spitfires were marvels of British engineering, but they were delicate. Their thin aluminium skin and overlapping panels left small gaps after combat. To the naked eye, they were insignificant, but at 300 miles per hour, those gaps disrupted airflow and reduced lift. Pilots noticed it instantly. "She feels heavy," they would say. "She's tired." And in a duel against the nimble Messerschmitt Bf-109, even the smallest loss of agility could mean the difference between victory and death. One morning, after a night of relentless bombing, George examined a Spitfire that had limped back to base. The right wing was slightly damaged. A section near the cannon housing had bent, leaving a thin slit that whistled in the wind. According to regulations, the aircraft was to be grounded until a full replacement part arrived. But there were no parts, no time. The Luftwaffe would be back within hours, and every Spitfire was needed in the air. That's when George had an absurd idea. While his fellow mechanics searched for rivets and metal sheets, he rummaged through a supply crate and pulled out a roll of heavy-duty duct tape, the same type used to seal heating ducts in air raid shelters. He tore long strips and carefully pressed them over the slit, smoothing them down with the palms of his hands until the surface looked almost new. It was ridiculous, the pride of the RAF patched together with tape. He laughed to himself and muttered, "A stupid little trick, that's all." But it had to fly. When the pilot, Flight Lieutenant Robert Finley, saw the makeshift repair, he burst out laughing. "You think tape's going to hold the air at 400 miles an hour?" He joked. George simply shrugged. "If it doesn't, it won't be the tape that kills you." Hours later, Finley climbed into the cockpit. The Merlin engine roared to life and the Spitfire took to the gray skies. On the radar screens, operators watched the German formation crossing the channel, dozens of Messerschmitts heading straight for Kent. The dogfight began high above the clouds, where sunlight met smoke and the air shimmered with tracer fire. Finley threw the Spitfire into a dive, pulled sharply up, and for the first time in weeks felt the aircraft respond as though reborn. The vibrations were gone. The controls felt crisp, light. He rolled, turned hard to port, and slipped in behind a Bf-109. One short burst, and the Messerschmitt spiraled down in flames. "This Spitfire's different," he shouted through the radio. "She's alive again." When he landed, still shaking from adrenaline, he ran to the hangar. "What did you do to my plane, George?" The mechanic, his face smeared with oil, smiled faintly. "I taped it up." Within days, the same aircraft flew 3 consecutive missions without needing repair. The improvement was undeniable. The squadron leader ordered every Spitfire to be taped and sealed before flight. And so began what the crews jokingly called the stupid trick that saved the Spitfires. The tape did something brilliantly simple. It sealed the gaps that created drag. With smoother airflow, the planes gained speed, stability, and maneuverability. Later tests confirmed an average gain of around 6 miles per hour, seemingly minor, but in air combat it was a world of difference. The seals also prevented dust and moisture from entering the gun ports, which reduced jamming during battle. Soon, other bases copied the method. Engineers from Supermarine, the Spitfire's manufacturer, came to investigate. Their internal report validated what the mechanics had discovered by instinct. Those small fissures were robbing the aircraft of performance. The stupid trick was officially adopted. From then on, every Spitfire had its wings carefully sealed before missions, and later the gun barrels were covered with thin red tape that burst open with the first shot, a symbol still seen on restored aircraft today. Across the channel, the Luftwaffe began to notice. Their pilots reported that the Spitfires now climbed faster, turned sharper, and held their energy better in prolonged fights. A German intelligence memo dated October 1940 mentioned an unexpected increase in agility among British fighters, with no explanation. The secret was not in new engines or weapons. It was in a roll of tape and the hands of men who refused to give up. But the genius of that fix wasn't only technical, it was human. The tape represented something deeper, the spirit of improvisation that defined Britain's resilience. When supplies ran dry and the factories could not deliver, the ground crews invented their own miracles. They fashioned new rivets from melted scrap, patched holes with tin from biscuit tins, and kept aircraft flying long after logic said they should have been written off. Every sortie, every interception over the channel was built on their invisible labor. George Henshaw never considered himself a hero. He saw his job as keeping machines alive long enough for the pilots to do theirs. Yet gradually, his stupid trick began to change outcomes. The squadron's readiness rate climbed dramatically and losses dropped. Spitfires that might have been grounded kept returning to the skies, and that meant more intercepts. More German bombers stopped, more civilians spared. It was a chain reaction of small advantages, and small advantages win wars. As the weeks passed, Biggin Hill became a symbol of defiance. The Luftwaffe's raids grew less frequent, the skies a little safer. And when Winston Churchill later said, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few," he was right, though perhaps he should have included the few who worked with wrenches and tape, as well as those who fought in the air. After the war, most of those mechanics faded back into ordinary life. George returned to Birmingham, opening a small garage on the edge of town. He rarely spoke about the war, but sometimes when a customer doubted one of his repairs, he would chuckle and say, "I've patched things that flew at 400 miles an hour." He died in 1963, largely forgotten, buried with no fanfare. Yet his legacy quietly lived on. Decades later, as historians restored Spitfires for museums and air shows, they uncovered old maintenance logs. Scrawled in pencil on the margins of one report were the words, "Fuselage sealed with tape. Performance improved." In homage, the engineers at Duxford and the Imperial War Museum still place red sealing tape over the gun ports of their Spitfires before every flight, not because it's needed, but because it's right. There's something almost poetic in that. Amid the noise and destruction, victory was built not just by strategy or production, but by countless acts of ingenuity from men like George, ordinary hands doing extraordinary things. A roll of tape, a bit of faith, and the refusal to give in. In a recorded interview from 1959, an elderly Robert Finley recalled the day he flew that taped-up Spitfire. "I thought she'd fall apart," he said, laughing softly, "but she flew better than ever. That's when I learned never to doubt a mechanic. They fought the war too, just with grease and tape instead of guns." The story never made it into official histories. There were no medals, no citations. But the truth is simple. A stupid trick kept the Spitfires in the air and helped turn the tide of one of the greatest battles in modern history. Because sometimes in war as in life, victory doesn't come from grand strategies or perfect machines. It comes from the smallest, smartest acts of improvisation. So the next time you see a Spitfire gleaming in a museum hangar, look closer at the red tape across its guns. It isn't decoration. It's a reminder that ingenuity often wears the face of desperation, and that history can turn on the quiet genius of a man with a roll of tape and the courage to use it. If you've enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel. There are hundreds more hidden in the hangars of history, stories of human creativity, courage, and the strange brilliance of the so-called stupid ideas that change the world.